Social media users are reporting that eBay is locking the accounts of users who sell over $600 worth of products until they submit their social security number for IRS reporting. The notice on eBay reads, as of January 1st, 2022, the IRS now requires us to file and send a 1099-K form to everyone who sells $600 or more. Please update your information so we can start sending your payouts and avoid other account restrictions. According to the New York Post, only 4% of the agency's $80 billion in new funding will go to customer service, despite their pledge to use the cash to, quote, help taxpayers.
According to the Washington Post, the bigger scandal is that right-wing threats against agents have been mounting. The Post reports that the IRS has launched a full security review. Post reporter Jacob Bogage writes, quote, the attacks on the IRS, other agencies, and federal employees make sense if delegitimizing government is the point. Meanwhile, Post columnist Dana Milbank for the opinion section says questioning the agency is part of the right's fascism problem. Quote, violent anti-government rhetoric from party leaders targets the FBI, the Justice Department, and the IRS. A systemic campaign of disinformation makes their supporters feel victimized by shadowy elites.
It's a very bad and lazy column. For targeting, how dare we criticize the FBI, the Justice Department, the IRS? We were criticizing the FBI in our A block today because there's a lot of sketchy stuff regarding how they handled the Hunter Biden probe.
Well, let's be a little bit specific, though, because I do think that obviously all of these organizations, any government organization or otherwise, has a mixed record and is subject to critique. I think part of the concern that people have, and I want to know what you think about this, is about the kind of rhetoric that's come out of the right that really emphasizes the minority of IRS agents that carry firearms and really implies that there are going to be raids, kind of FBI-style raids on the homes of American citizens, and that American citizens should, in effect, arm up and start targeting FBI agents the way we've already seen FBI agents target since the Mar-a-Lago incident.
Fine. I didn't think there was some suggestion that there are going to be armed IRS agents. To me, that was not the concerning thing about the new news. I generally don't freak out when people have guns. People should be allowed to have guns. I'm not a gun control supporter, as we've talked about in other contexts. So that didn't trigger me the way it triggered some people. Mm-hmm. I take your point on that. The scary thing about the IRS is not that they're going to shoot you. They're going to make your life more difficult by tying you up in more procedures. Or they're going to make it harder for people who earn a living doing not I just work a 9-to-5 job, but I make my income. Maybe I do rideshare sometimes. Maybe I make stuff and sell it on eBay. Maybe I do all these various things. Yeah. And the concern is the IRS is adding a lot of muscle. It's saying it's adding muscle so it can really get those rich sons of a gun who can screw people who don't pay their fair share of the taxes. But as we've seen previously, it's so much easier for the IRS to go after you, to make your life more difficult.
That's complicated, Robbie.
I know, it's a chicken and egg problem.
I'm sympathetic to that argument. And then when we first started talking about it on the show, you can go back and listen. I was very sympathetic to that. But I also think we have to reckon with the numbers that we have and the statistics that we have, which are the best thing that I think we can do to predict what's going to happen with the increased funding. And the funding increases that are being proposed or that have been passed in the Inflation Reduction Act are literally returning the IRS to the numbers that it had 10 years ago. And when you look back to what the IRS did 10 years ago, it did much, much more. I forget the actual percentage number, but overwhelmingly more enforcement among elites and holding them accountable for their taxes than they do now. And part of the argument that's being made by the IRS now is that they focus on lower income cases because those are easier cases. Rich people have lawyers, it's protracted litigation, they have accountants, they know how to hide their money and cover their tracks, and it requires more resources to do so. I mean, what do you make of that?
So there's two arguments I want to toss your way, see what you make of them. So one thing I've heard, that I've heard other libertarian people make, is that regardless of how much IRS enforcement you have or how you tinker or change whatever you're doing, the government basically collects about 19% of GDP in taxes, no matter what we do. And that's basically all they can that's all the money they can wring out of people.
How can you say no matter what we do? And we've seen
historically, there's not been a massive swing in how much money.
But there has been a meaningful change in what the IRS has been able to collect, especially from rich people, over just the last 10 years, depending on how well they're funded.
The other thing would be, so my argument would be, we clearly need to make the tax code simpler
100%.
Because it is so confusing. And it's more confusing, the fact that it's confusing, rather, impacts people with less financial means
100%.
more because wealthy people can afford tax attorneys to legally not pay their tax. I mean, they're not all committing crimes. They're doing things that are perfectly legal.
Yes, and they spend their money to lobby to make sure that we don't simplify the tax code. The government knows how much you owe every month. That's how they do it every year.
Why can't they just tell us?
They could just tell us. But the very rich people spend a lot of money to make sure that doesn't happen, and all of the banks and tax preparers also spend a lot of money lobbying to make sure that their services don't become obsolete.
Yeah.
So this is the problem.
It is a huge problem. My taxes are, I'm a privileged person. You're probably like this too, though. If you have freelance income, if you have a variety of income sources, which a lot of journalists and media figures do, it starts to get darn complicated.
Yeah, this is the first year that I'm going to really have to be dealing with that. I'm not looking forward to it.
It's a mess. It's an absolute mess.
Right. So I think we're in agreement on that. That there is some tinkering happening here around the edges that is, eluding the bigger problem here, and that I think that elites in both parties don't really want to reckon with that. I do think we have to take a little bit of a wait and see approach to see what happens with the staffing up of IRS agents. If it is true that they come after little people like folks spending $600 on eBay and don't go after the big dogs, I will be right there with you objecting, and we should keep an eye on this and have accountability. But I also think we have to deal with this. This is from Representative Andrew Clyde from Georgia this month on the House floor. He says, think about it. If the left will weaponize the FBI to raid President Trump's personal residence, they will surely weaponize the IRS's new 87,000 agents, many of whom will be trained in the use of deadly force to go after any American citizen. Rick Scott, chairman of the National Senatorial Committee, says IRS hires will need to be ready to the IRS needs to be ready to audit and investigate your fellow hardworking Americans, your neighbors, and your friends. You need to be ready and to use the IRS words willing to kill them. I mean, this is the kind of rhetoric that the article is pushing back on. And whatever I think about how the IRS could be weaponized against poor people, is this an issue that we have representatives talking in these violent terms about members, American citizens, and people who work for the government?
Okay. Yes, the right-wing rhetoric from a lot of Republicans has gotten totally out of control. I find it off-putting and weird. I don't even think it's tactically smart because it clearly turns people off. The kinds of, I did that radar on the rhino hunting ad from that deranged Missouri failed candidate. Yes, it's very bad in right-wing political spheres that there's a reward from a certain part of the base. So there's a dopamine hit on social media from activating your craziest followers. Mm-hmm. It's just not representative of how most people feel about it, and it has encouraged a lot of people to go way too far in how they talk about these things. That said, and that aside, I don't think it is not wrong to cast aspersions on law enforcement. I mean, that's something the left does. That's something the left does all the time, and I'm right there with them saying that police have too much power and abuse that power and harm citizens, sometimes in a racially insensitive or racially discriminatory way. And I agree with all that.
And if Ayanna Pressley gets on TV and says the cops, the pigs are coming for you, you got to arm up and be willing to kill them, what would the response be from the right?
The response would be, if she said literally that would be pretty bad. She should not say that.
This is the, I was going to say the subtext, but it's pretty much the text of what's being said by not all, but some conservatives. Yeah. And I do think there is some legitimacy in asking whether or not there are going to be bad downstream effects from that kind of rhetoric.
Yes, but there is bad downstream. We can't. There's bad downstream effects of It's hard. The other side does that a lot too. They honestly do. I mean, there's extreme rhetoric on both sides, and I think it's often very lazy to draw this is why there's more violence because people say those things.
But when
they should not say it because it's not appropriate. Period.
When a sitting progressive or moderate Democrat starts talking about people arming up to shoot and being willing to kill federal employees, I think we'll be in a similar tit for tat case. But this does feel like an escalation of the likes of which we haven't seen from our sitting congressional representatives. That's all I'm saying. The underlying concerns about the IRS, I'm perfectly willing to entertain, but I do think that this represents, this ongoing
political rhetoric has
shift.
always been pretty. There was maybe a period of time when we were much younger where there was a lot less, I guess, anger in our political system. But the things that 100 or 200 years ago, right? It was all trying to somebody beat somebody with a cane on the steps of the Capitol, not in 2020, but in 1863 or whatever. So just saying.
Well, all right. I guess we have to make sure people are well caned on the House floor.
We should cane our representatives philosophically, not using actual violence. They should be caned at the polls by the voters.
Rhetorically,
to be clear. Team Rising joins us next. Stay with us.